Hello, and welcome to another episode of Moore DEI Discussions, a series of conversations with C-suite executives who share their candid insight into many of the important aspects of creating and advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion principles and practices in their organizations. I am Marlon Moore, president of Marlon Moore Consulting, and thank you for joining us. Today, I am pleased to be joined by my good friend Bob Carter, chairman of Carter, which advances philanthropy worldwide by counseling nonprofit organizations in the area of fundraising, organizational planning, and governance. Bob established Bob Carter Companies in 2011 and currently serves as the chairman under the new Carter brand. Prior to forming Bob Carter Companies, he spent 3 years as a senior advisor for Changing Our World, an Omicron nonprofit group. Before this, Bob spent 26 years with Ketchum, one of America's largest fundraising consulting firms. Bob currently serves as a member of the board of the World Health Organization Foundation, Bridge Philanthropic Consulting, and the African American Development Officers Network, where he is a founding board member. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome Bob Carter to Moore DEI Discussions. How are you, Bob?
I'm well. Thanks, Marlon. Glad to be here.
Good. Glad you could take time to join us today. So before we get into some of the questions, in which I do want to talk about two areas that I haven't covered much on Moore DEI Discussions, which is why I'm so glad you decided to join us. I want to get into a little bit about board diversity, and then some of the challenges that diverse groups experience within the philanthropic community. But before we do that, Bob, how about you tell us just a little bit more about Carter?
Sure. I'll tell you the history of Carter is that basically when I left the Omnicom group, I won't necessarily reveal my age, but I was retirement qualified. And
Okay.
And fundamentally, I was retired for 10 weeks and it didn't work very well. And in order to preserve my marriage, I decided to start another business. And that's how this got started. I talked to some of my colleagues in New York and other places and just started a small private practice with 3 clients and a part-time assistant. And today, fast forward 11 years later, and we have over 50 consultants. We're working in 8 countries, and I'm chair, but I also have a great CEO, Steve Higgins, who really runs the day-to-day of the company. We're not a boutique company in the sense that we only work in one part of the 501c3 market. We work in all charities, ranging from education, healthcare. We do a lot of humanitarian NGO work on a global basis. And those 8 countries include 5 in Asia and Australia, Canada, and you name it, some parts of Europe as well. One of the differences with our company is that we don't just raise money in the United States to send to those countries, but we actually help raise money in those countries, which is a big kind of critical difference. We do custom design work. Our campaigns, a lot of it's centered around either capital or endowment campaigns or combines of those 2 areas. And they range anywhere from 5 million to the largest one we're doing right now is 1.5 billion, University of Mississippi, as a matter of fact. Okay. But, we do a lot of things. What keeps it interesting, by the way, arts is a big part of our mix as well. But it's one of those things where the diversity of our client base keeps it very interesting for our consultants as well as for me personally to see us work in all these different fields. And what we learn in one area helps us be better in another area. Mm-hmm. And that combination seems to work well. We're active in the Association of Fundraising Professionals and support their code of ethics. We participate in every community where we live and are a philanthropic company as well. So That's we're based in Vero Beach, Florida. I live in Sarasota, Florida, but we have consultants who live all over the U.S. and outside the U.S. also.
That's
So
phenomenal.
that's kind of who we are. It's a very good 10 or 11-year story in terms of the growth of the company, but I think it's based on sound principles and ethical work. So I think it's going to last a little while.
That's great, Bob. Thank you for sharing that. And smart move with focusing on your marriage and doing the things that keep your household happy.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate you sharing that context about your reach, whether it's domestically or internationally. But one question I usually like to start off with, and I don't want to change up, the script today either. And so I'll ask you, Bob, why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important to you specifically?
Well, I've always, I was the president of Ketchum, that larger company, for a long time, for about 13 years. And, and at that time, and we're going back into in the 90s and 80s and so on. And it was abundantly clear that there was a big difference in not only the presence of fundraisers of color and of who didn't look like me, but there was a real inequity in terms of the capacity of institutions who those individuals represented having access to dollars, and it was very clear. And early on in my time at Ketchum, we became one of the first Northeastern fundraising companies, large companies, to work with HBCUs. And my early work at Fisk University is something I'm really proud of. And I went on to work with about 9 other HBCUs, and being able to bring that funding to another level. What's important about DEI issues and all that sort of thing, the egalitarian part of this country's philosophy and my personal philosophy have much to do with everyone playing on a level field. And I saw that really wasn't going to happen. And early on, Marlon, I was told that, what are you doing working in the African American community, because there's not a lot of money there, fundraising money. And wow. I said, well, let's follow it. There's a reason why there might not be. And secondly, I was told that community was not very philanthropic. And, in America, we tend to measure philanthropy by cash. Working around the world and understanding this, philanthropy is measured in many other ways. And what I discovered in the early years of working in the African American community and other agencies beyond higher education was that it was a very philanthropic culture, because people took care of each other. Their love of fellow man was evidenced every day because they fed their neighbors. And what I also discovered was much philanthropy happened between the church and fraternal orders. And that was the access for fundraising in that community. If I wanted anything to be successful, I had to have someone in the pulpit, and I had to have someone in one of the sorority or fraternity organizations who would endorse this, and then it would go forward. And people were very generous, etc. And having, lived through that, and then the CASE organization, Council for Advancement and Support of Education, put together something called a minority forum. And I was one of the first speakers in that group back in the 80s. And we made real progress in bringing together, anywhere from 30 to 40 people of color who got better training and got focused training and intentional training, and in some cases better placement for positions than they might have had otherwise. So I've always enjoyed being a part of that. And and some of this, frankly, Marlon, comes from my background. I grew up in a very small town in Elk Ridge, Maryland, and I tell people we were too poor to be prejudiced. Everybody in that community had to do their job, and everybody sort of leaned in on a problem. If it was a community problem, didn't matter what color you are or where you live, but we all had to make it happen. And I learned that from my parents and grandparents who were very close to the African American community there. And my grandfather in particular, because he was an amateur boxer and most of his buddies were African American boxers. And so I saw this happening there it's just as a little kid. So it's always been something that's been in the front of my mind on how we do a better job of that and get everybody up to give them a chance to play on the equal level playing field. And that's been a personal desire, and I've tried to do that in my companies and through some of my partnerships that I even currently have. Well, we do that. That's a lot of words. I'm sorry I went on.
No, it's great perspective. I appreciate your personal perspective, your upbringing, and how that has influenced and shaped your point of view, as well as your previous work experience. It sounds like you were at an organization who was getting out in front of this work, especially with historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, which I'm proud to be a graduate of one, Virginia State University. And
I worked there.
Russell, look at that connection. So thank you for your work at VSU, because it helped produce Dr. Marlon Moore.
There we go. Good.
Very much appreciate that. But you touched on something, Bob, that I want to go back to, because I recently read an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And I'm going to quote the article here. It says, leaders of color have inequitable access to social networks that enable connections to the philanthropic community. Leaders of color have inequitable access to social networks that enable connections to the philanthropic community. Any thoughts about that point of view?
I think that's pretty much what I was talking about, because we all I call it spheres of influence. We all have a sphere that's around us, and if you look around, who's in it? Well, the majority of the time you look at it as people like you, people who look like you, act like you, whatever it might be. And where is your circle? Well, your circle may be in an area where you are getting exposed to others who have resources, et cetera. And so there's a lack of diversity in those levels of socializing, if you will, to make that kind of a connection happen. And what happens is then the organizations who don't have people or board members in those circles, they have to work much harder to get into that relationship, because in a sense it's an abnormal thing, because somebody who's already in that circle asks for an appointment and they get it because they know them. And I was at a leadership conference for AFP a couple of years ago in Washington, D.C., about a year pre-COVID. And I was talking about the fact that I get invited to make recommendations for people to get hired all the time. I'm on some kind of a list with headhunting firms, I guess, or I've just been hanging around too long. And I told the folks in the room there, I said, the problem is I only know who I know. And when they make that call, if I don't know you, I can't recommend you because I'm not aware. I've had some help with that over the years with good people from the AFP, Association of Fundraising Professionals Board. It's individuals of color who have helped me in circumstances like that, because we would network and say, who do we both know in this area, to make sure that we were having some diversity in the decisions that got made, et cetera. So I think that's a very valid point, and that was a Stanford study, I think. And very valid points in that article, and that's one of the key ones. So I've had a hang up about I only know who I know. So what I did at that meeting was I wrote my email and mobile phone number up on the board, and I said, call me.
Sure.
Talk to me. And that got a pretty good response. And I've been able to increase my network with being on the founding board member of the African American Development Officers Group, which has 3,000 members who are fundraisers of color. And now I have a network that I can reach into for that. But unless, and frankly, Marlon, unless somebody is intentional like that, they sit in their own sphere of influence and don't break out.
Sure.
And that's a problem.
Yeah, so I would imagine, Bob, that's kind of a two-way interaction, right? So you have those who are in charge of distributing dollars, but then those who are leaders of organizations have to do their part as well. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, it works on both sides of the equation.
Yeah.
Organizations, and I'm a past board member of an organization that has done really, really well on diversifying its board leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really done a crackerjack job. And yet, in fact, 46% of the members of the board are of color now. It's a national organization. And yet the membership is less than 12%. And that's where the problem is, because they're actually not reaching into the villages and the towns and sometimes the big cities and getting enough people engaged in the professional work in the numbers that they should be. So, okay, it's a little bit easier to solve the board problem, but if you have 25,000 members, you gotta work really hard to grow that minority portion of that group, which can be increased significantly. So it's complicated to do this right, and it has to be intentional, and all the time remaining focused on quality and better opportunity through better education, and then maintaining standards, etc. This isn't a check the box kind of thing that's going to solve the problem here. It's more complicated than that.
Sure. So, Bob, you served on a number of boards. Okay, so let's get into that for a second. I think many of our viewers and listeners understand the role of a board from a governance perspective. But when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, what do you see as the board's role in ensuring that our organization kind of lives up to this strategic imperative?
Well, it's always interesting that, take a look at the board and then take a look at the service area or the community in which it works.
That's right.
And you say, okay, what does this look like? Is there any parity between those two? And, historically, that's been a big no in most cases. And it's like, I'm not naming the boards I'm on, but I know a lot of boards because I've worked with them on governance issues. In the Northeast, a very good board in one of the big Northeastern cities. And they worked primarily, they did healthcare in, I would say, North and West Philadelphia. And no, East Philadelphia. No, West Philadelphia. Anyhow, North Philadelphia for sure, which is, a tough area. And I walked into that boardroom and I was almost blinded by the whiteness in the room. And its service area, its service is primarily an African American community. Had a black mayor of Philadelphia at the time and I'm looking around the room and I'm thinking, well, wow, this is nice, but gosh, are you in any way reflecting the values that are right outside this door?
That's right.
And how do you know what's the way you ought to be making certain decisions if you don't have that voice in the room?
That's right.
And in many cases, it's all you need is the voice. You need it at the table. It doesn't mean, you're flipping a board 100% or anything like that, but you must have voice and you must have that kind of representation. So that's a problem. And it starts at the top and it flows through the organization most of the time, whatever kind of an institution it is. So that's my observation. And I've been a part of boards that struggled with that. I've been a voice for that. Didn't always go well, but you have to have the voice. I think today, and that was pretty much historically, but today, there's a lot more awareness of how important and how strengthening that is.
Mm-hmm.
When you diversity is a source of strength, not weakness.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's what this country's concept is built on.
Yeah.
And we're still struggling with it as a country. But if you take away immigrations, we would part of my family would be here, but a lot of the rest of us wouldn't be
Sure.
as Native Americans. So we're all diverse. E pluribus unum is out of many one. And our boards have to really take a look at that. I think they're doing a much better job today than they ever have, but there's plenty of room to grow with boards.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'm actually a part of a board here in Central Ohio, United Way of Central Ohio, so shout out to them, that is actually requesting the board demographic of organizations they fund. And that's largely in part to ensure, to your point, Bob, that the boards reflect the communities where the dollars are going. And so it's really great to see that occur. But then also, I think it's important for boards to hold organizational leaders accountable for coming up with plans specific to this work and making sure that they're executing against those. So whether they have a workforce objective, supplier diversity, community engagement, they have to hold usually the CEO and their leadership team accountable for progress and action. So
have an annual training in it, whatever. There's steps that can be taken that are evidence of progress. And will it ever be perfect? I don't think so. But we always say it's progress, not perfection. We have to be progressing.
That's right. It's a journey.
Yeah,
it's a journey.
Absolutely.
So before I let you go, Bob, I would be remiss if I didn't put you on the spot. Never done this before. I'm gonna put you on the spot. We're gonna role play, so to speak. So I've started a new nonprofit designed to support African American women who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, and I want to go out and raise dollars. What would you share with me as some best practices for fundraising as a new nonprofit or even tenured nonprofit? But I'm sure that matters. But just, I got to learn from the expert. How can I go out and raise some dollars, Bob?
Raise money. Well, like so many things I say, it starts with the board. So you need to assemble a group of people who have certain, I call them qualifications. Number one, they must be passionate about the cause. So they've got to be believers themselves, because one of their very important roles is advocacy. They have to be willing to tell their sphere of influence and others how great this mission is and why we're carrying this out. And they have to develop their own story. They have to be able to tell another person why they're there, why they made that decision. And that's a principle of fundraising. Fundraising is nothing but storytelling. We tell the story of the institution, and then I tell my story about why it's important to me, and then I invite someone else to invest in it just like I have.
Sure. Okay.
And it's a value proposition. So building a board with people who are passionate, and we say that building a board with people who have capacity to support in one way or another, and sometimes it's through the resources they have access to or their own, one or the other, because financial is part of the responsibility. We think that everybody should give up to their capacity to give. We don't expect them to sell their houses to make the gift or anything, but up to their capacity to give. And the other qualification is that they have to have wisdom. They're bringing something to the table to help you in your fundraising or in your programmatic support. And the other part of it is working. They have to be people who are willing to work. One of the mistakes that's made early on sometimes is people get, they get names, and they have half a dozen really good names in the community, but they're not going to do anything. They haven't committed to it. They just kind of sound good and look good. I'd rather just have the endorsement. I don't want to put them on my board and have them help me as an endorser, et cetera. but building that leadership group that cares deeply about what you're doing and is willing to do the early hard work to develop resources for you with their reach into the community, into the national, local, regional community, wherever it might be. That's going to be critical because they become, as a founder, let's pretend like you're the CEO, they're going to be your partners, basically, in developing this kind of an enterprise. And I could go on and talk about how to build it out, but you probably don't want me to do that.
No, we'll just have to schedule another episode, Bob,
Sure.
and finish that. But no, that was very helpful. Yeah. I guess as we kind of round out our conversation, and you've touched on so much today, from board structure to ensuring equity amongst organizations, how the onus falls on leadership within nonprofits to raise dollars, as well as those board members. So a number of things we discussed today. But as we kind of wrap out, I just want to ask you, if you think about this work, your many contributions to HBCUs, working in underserved communities, what parting advice would you leave organizational leaders? You mentioned earlier, this is a journey, right? So what parting advice would you leave for organizational leaders who want to do better in the DEI space? Yeah,
I would say this. There are a couple pieces of this. One is you must be intentional about it. And you have to develop your plan for your agency and your culture on how this will work. You can't look over your shoulder at another agency and say, okay, we're going to do that. Sure. You got to do the hard work, which is inside, and develop a plan that's going to make sense for your agency. So that's number one. The other part of it is recognize that it's not going to be all peaches and cream. And understand that. And if you are making an intentional move to bring in more diversity, equity, inclusion into the room, do it in numbers that make sense. Don't bring one representative in and say, okay, here we go. Because number one, that's an awfully uncomfortable position for that person. So I would say try to bring a class in that is more diverse and another class following it, and so on. Do it over a period of 3 to 5 years and develop a plan along those lines. Because very often some really good people get invited onto the board. They look around the room and say, well, I'm it. And that's a very lonely feeling for a lot of people. Doesn't bother some people, but it's kind of lonely. The other part of advice, the third piece I'll give is, today, all leadership has to be adaptive. I don't know what's coming in the next 6 months to 12 months. I wish I did. There used to be some better predictors going on, but the world is moving rapidly. So make sure that your CEO, as well as your senior leadership, your board, all have an understanding of what adaptive leadership is, and look for answers in some places where you never had to look before. So that's part of that's asking yourselves the right questions and then listening to others from the outside. Wow, Bob, that is so powerful. Adaptive leadership. I may need to borrow that because I think I have a new line here. I stole it. I got to give credit to the Harvard Business Review, October 2020. It's a great article. No, thank you for that. But adaptive leadership leads to inclusion. So being open to ideas and perspectives that ultimately can foster innovation and performance. But being open to that matters. So I don't want to talk too much over that because I think that's a great place to leave it. Adaptive leadership leads to inclusion. I think is a great message. So Bob, thank you so much. This has been phenomenal. Thank you for your many contributions to this work. Your continued voice and leadership matters to many communities as we ensure equity on both the board level, on the philanthropic level, and in society in general. So again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for listening. Marlin Moore Consulting is a diversity,
equity and inclusion strategy development firm, helping organizations build their diversity strategy by providing them with resources to support their execution. For more information, visit marlonmoore.com. And remember, diversity starts with you.